Okay, so that is, let me just make sure I'm in the right spot. Yeah. So that is the economy. Well, how does this affect families? It affects families because of unemployment rates. So, for example, during this recession, people lost their job, they had their hours reduced, and the worst cases, they filed for bankruptcy. That might mean losing their home they had a mortgage on, losing possessions, giving up family pets, switching schools, a totally different standard of living. In the US, since they have a different health system than we do, this also meant many lost their health insurance. I mean, really think about it. If one or both of your parents lost work and were not able to find other work, what would happen? It would affect you every day and cause every family member that was old enough to understand a great deal of stress. And it would have a lasting effect, an effect far beyond that period of unemployment. We just can't make the mortgage payment, so what do? Well, let's take money out of savings. Let's take money out of our retirement fund. See if we can cash in part of our pension. Take out cash advances on our credit cards. And again, enormous, enormous stress and worry to the point of maybe affecting one's marriage, their ability to properly parent, maybe even affecting their health. Stress from unemployment even contributes to incidents of domestic violence. So, being unemployed for a period of time doesn't just directly affect that period of time, it has a latent effect as well. You already know that a person's socioeconomic status affects every part of their life, and families no different. So, a loss of income can, in every sense, without being dramatic, be disastrous. And for some families, the stress and anxiety caused by their unstable financial situation is normal. They never experience what it's like to not have a lot of stress and worry about their economic status. In Canada, as of April 1st, 2022, the federal minimum wage went from $15 an hour to $15.55. Oh, I have $15.50 here. It should be $15.55. You're not going to be asked that on the test anyways. Now, in the US, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And first you think, oh my God, that's half ours. That sucks. But what this means in the US is that nowhere in the country can anybody be paid less than this. But many states also have their own minimum wage laws, meaning in some states the minimum wage is much higher. So, for example, here at California, the minimum wage is $13. But in Tennessee, it's $7.25. So it depends where you are. In the states where an employee is subject to both the state and the federal minimum wage laws, the employee is always going to be entitled to the higher of the two wages. Now, some adults make minimum wage. They've always made minimum wage, and they are unlikely to ever see that change. I think as a whole, we tend to think of minimum wage as a starting point. But for some adults, it's also the end point. The big question is minimum wage the same as a living wage, meaning that it can cover their basic expenses plus all relevant taxes? The answer to that is no, dependent on where a person lives. So a living wage and a minimum wage are not the same thing. And this is also the main number one argument behind increases for minimum wage in both Canada and the States. If a person makes minimum wage and works full-time 40 hours a week and still cannot pay their basic bills, that's a big problem. And that is the reasoning for mandating an increase in minimum wage. In addition to much lower pay, adults of a lower socioeconomic status also are more likely to have to deal with a non-standard work schedule. Now, non-standard can refer to work being non-standard in several ways. Might mean irregular shifts, so your schedule is different every week. It might refer to split shifts. So here you see examples of split shifts. You work a couple hours here and a couple hours there on the same day. Non-standard work might refer to part-time or contract temporary work. In some way, the work is not standard. And because of that, it's not quite as stable. Non-permanent work can be a big issue for a number of reasons beyond the obvious that it's not permanent. So you don't really know how long you're going to have the job. Temporary, contract, non-permanent work, whatever you want to call it, very, very rarely includes health benefits or sick days or vacation days, which means you're going to have more expenses. And in addition, without job security, you're much less likely to speak up for your rights at work. You're much less likely to advocate for yourself. Even so, temporary work is the fastest growing category of workers in North America. And within this category, you're more likely to find women. Now, I do want to point out that while temp work affects people of a lower socioeconomic status more than others, this does not just affect lower wage jobs. For example, in Canada, 75% of university professors are not permanent employees. We're on contract. And I know this isn't common knowledge. Instead you see a strike occur and everybody's focused on how much permanent tenured professors make and how ridiculous that is. But the fact is, those permanent tenured professors represent an extremely small minority of the professor population. No, 3/4 of us are not permanent, which makes a huge difference in salary as well as access to health benefits. But whether for a lower wage or a higher wage job, if that's all you can find, what else can you do? Some work is better than no work. That's what it boils down to. Yes, non-standard work can be more stressful. It can cause more worry, it can cause weariness, and over time, it can directly negatively affect a person's ability to parent because it wears them down more. Not because you don't want to be a parent, but let's say you work the evening shift, for example, from 3 in the afternoon to 12 midnight. Well, how much time are you going to have to spend with your kids? If you work the night shift, you're on a completely different schedule than the rest of your family. So I know for most people, when they read that, for children whose parents work non-standard hours, that they're more likely to have behavioral problems or, that kind of thing, most people think that's ridiculous. But I mean, really think about it in reality. Think about what it would be like day to day, week in and week out, and you realize, yeah, I could see that having a negative effect. And the fact is, in lower wage jobs tied to unemployment and the effect of that on a family is that you're easily replaced. If a job requires a specific kind of education or a specific kind of training, then it is rarely a matter of just pulling out the folder of applications from your desk and selecting somebody to call for an interview. But for those jobs that do not require specialized education or training, that's exactly what occurs. There's a much, much higher turnover rate in low-income occupations compared to higher-income occupations. Another way of saying this is that an employee is easily replaced and the employer knows it and the employee knows it. And just as I say this, I'm thinking of the grocery store that I frequent the most. Every few months or so, they have a sign up saying that they're hiring cashiers or somebody else. But you don't see that in other occupations. I found it kind of ironic in your text that the author talks about a woman named Eliza who was hired 30 to 40 hours a week at a fast food restaurant, but only ended up working about 20 hours a week because that's all they gave her. Because I've had more than one conversation with students over the years who have had the exact same experience working in a restaurant or a grocery store. So they've either been hired to work part-time and are constantly given full-time hours, or they're hired to work full-time and instead are given less than 20 hours a week. And what are they going to do? If they quit and can't find something else, then they're out of work. If they complain, they could have their hours changed even more. So they end up working less than they want because it's all they can find, or they end up working more than they can really handle because it's all they can find. And again, if you're stuck in that situation, what options do you really have? Now, since your text is an American text, the author goes into quite a bit of detail regarding health care and health insurance in the US. in terms of employment and effect on family. You do not need to know all the ins and outs of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which was the comprehensive health care reform signed into law by President Barack Obama in March 2010. You should know, however, basically what it is. It was health care reform that was designed to extend health coverage to millions of Americans who had no health insurance. So this is a law, and the purpose of the Affordable Care Act was to make sure that all Americans have access to affordable health insurance. How? Let's make this as simple as possible. It essentially offers people discounts on government-sponsored health insurance plans if they're below a certain income. And it expands Medicaid assistance for low-income people to include more people. And it's changed some of the rules that health insurance companies have to follow. So for example, in the past, if you had some kind of pre-existing medical condition, let's say diabetes, you could be turned down for insurance, or the cost for your insurance coverage would just skyrocket. Now, because of the Affordable Care Act, you can't be turned down for any kind of pre-existing reason, and the costs have been contained more. So that's just really generally all you need to know about the Affordable Care Act in the US. And I mean, and you should have a basic knowledge about it, not just because I'm talking about it right now in this course. You should generally know what it is, since what occurs in the US often directly impacts Canadians. So now we're going to switch gears a bit. And instead of focusing on paid labor, although that'll still come into the discussion, let's focus on unpaid labor in the home and how that affects families. And you know, I don't know why I have such an issue with some of the titles in this text, this chapter particularly, but here I go again. Analyze the sociocultural context of household labor. You want to know my sociocultural context? It took my 16-year-old kid 16 years to master replacing the toilet paper roll in the bathroom. That's my sociocultural context.
That was one time.
Oh, he heard me. I'm recording. He's like, it's one time. Yes, the work that occurs within a household is work. Yes, it is just as important to a family's health and well-being as paid labor. And yes, it's affected by culture and society. Now note, when we use the term housework, that's exactly what we're referring to, housework, not childcare. That's something different. So the term household labor or housework, that's work around the house, not childcare. Yes, some do like doing certain kinds of housework. Some don't like others. I don't particularly like housework. If I never had to do laundry again for the rest of my life, I'd be an extremely happy person. Same with dishes, although that's because I have an older home with a kitchen that was installed in 1968 and I don't have a dishwasher. So yeah, there's most housework I don't like, household labor. But when it comes to occasional labor, which means things that don't have to be done every day, people tend to not mind occasional labor as much. Mowing the lawn, weeding the garden, raking leaves. Yes, there is a continued gendered division of labor in the home. First of all, just in terms of time. Women spend twice as much time on housework as men, even now. And you know, over the last several decades, the household division of labor based on gender has really declined in rigidity, in part because more and more mothers began working outside the home. But as you know, this doesn't mean that household labor is now roughly split 50-50. It's not that, okay, you know, women work outside the home just as much as men, so we're pretty close to an even split of work in the house. No, that's not what's happened. Instead, women still spend about twice as much time on household labor as men. And I want to be clear, that comes from numerous studies in numerous disciplines and is widely accepted as just that, a fact. So when I say that women still do about twice as much work as men in the home, I mean just that. Well, who's most likely to do what? We know research tells us that women are more often responsible for tasks that are immediate, meaning they just can't be put off. Getting dinner ready, for example, making lunches for the kids. Well, men tend to be responsible for tasks that they can do when they want to, like mowing the lawn, shoveling the driveway, cleaning the car. I'm going to go back a slide. Women tend to be much more responsible for household labor, housework. Men tend to be much more responsible for occasional labor. Comparing these tasks, which usually generates more stress? Well, those that have an immediate deadline, of course, the ones that you can't put off. Makes sense. If you can't put something off, well, you can't put something off. Now, what about same-sex marriages? I don't know. And unfortunately, not enough time has passed with same-sex marriages as a widely accepted norm for that information to just commonly make it into textbooks. So for me, I know one of the things I would just automatically wonder is, are husbands aware of this? Are they aware of this difference? Are they aware that their wives do much more than them around the house? Or do they not realize the extent of it? Or do they realize it and just not care and figure I got the better end of the deal? Husbands do tend to overestimate the household work they do and to underestimate that of their wives. In other words, they think that they're doing more than they really are, and they tend to think their wives are doing less than they really are. I have to be honest here. You know, there's certain concepts and people I talk about in almost every class. So that sometimes information in different courses runs together into my head and I just can't keep it straight what I've talked about in which course at what time. But I'm pretty sure I've mentioned Arlie Hochschild and her concept of the second shift for women, stating that women work a second shift of work at home that men do not, because they do the lion's share of household labor and childcare and anything else that's necessary to keep a household and family going. And Dr. Hochschild found that on average, women spend about 15 hours a week more than men doing housework, even when they participate in the paid labor force. So, okay, that's one thing. That all has to do with household labor, housework. When we look specifically at childcare, what do we see? We see pretty much the same thing, that mothers are more involved with childcare than fathers. But I want to be clear here. It is not that most fathers are not involved at all. And it's not that fathers have not increased their involvement with childcare on average, because they have. But mothers still do much more, comparatively speaking. So there's been a more equitable distribution of childcare responsibilities, but it's not wholly equitable yet. Is it positive that fathers are much more directly involved in childcare with their own children? Absolutely. Do most fathers still have a long way to go to be completely equal with mothers in regards to childcare? Absolutely. Your text indicates this, that in 1965, on average, a father in the U.S. spent 2.5 hours a week with their child. And by 2017, that had increased to 7.3 hours a week, which is really positive. It's not where it needs to be, but it's positive. And this disproportionate responsibility for children and for housework between moms and dads means there is a significant leisure gap for mothers, which comes back to Arlie Hochschild. She said that women, especially working mothers, have less leisure time on average than men. There's a gap in the leisure time each has to make use of. And well, think about it. If one person has more time to relax and de-stress than another person, not surprisingly, the one that gets less time is going to be more stressed. Of course they will. And keep in mind as well, this would be the normal state of the home. not an anomaly. It wouldn't be atypical. This would simply be the way things were, week in and week out. So this tendency for fathers to consistently do less than mothers, resulting in much less downtime for mothers, is especially discomforting for women for whom being in a truly equal relationship, a true partnership, is important. And thus, the women are less likely to be satisfied with their marriage. And you know, your text makes a point that I've just noticed in my everyday life regarding people I know more than once. Your text says that for men, they compare themselves to their father and think, I'm really doing a lot. I'm really a modern day father because I'm doing so much more than my father did. And they focus on this, and so they think they have this general feeling, this general perception that they're doing more than they really are. And I've made that observation outside of class more than once. A family I know that lives out of town has kids, and every night it's the father who makes dinner and then the wife cleans up afterwards, which sounds like a pretty equal arrangement, and the husband perceives it that way as well. But she does everything else. Laundry, cleaning, grocery shopping, most of the childcare, etc. You name it, she doesn't. She doesn't. Why doesn't the husband see that how they've negotiated their household roles is nowhere near as equal as he thinks it is? Because he focuses on the fact that he's doing much more than his dad did. And then in addition, their closest friend's marriage, the husband does absolutely nothing. It's like they're in the 1950s. So compared to his dad and compared to their neighbors, this father is at least doing something. But the fact is, even though he's doing something, the wife still does much, much more, and he still has more leisure time. So this may sound like a really overly simplistic question, but why is it like this? You know, just in a general sense, why is it like this? Our society has evolved, socially speaking, so much further than it was in the 1950s. Life certainly isn't perfect, but you know, women's rights have advanced in regards to education, in regards to the workplace, having control over their own fertility. There are more women in politics and other decision-making positions. Well, then why is the leisure gap in the home still so big? Why does it exist at all? In other words, why is there still such a firm gendered division of labor in the home? Well, we've got some ideas about this. One possible reason is that women spend fewer hours in paid labor and thus are more available to complete household work that needs to be done. This is called the time availability perspective. And what the time availability perspective says is, sure, theoretically, household work, whether that's childcare or housework, should be split 50-50 when both adults work full-time. That's the ideal. But husbands typically have more demanded of them regarding paid labor. Women typically have less demanded of them regarding paid labor. So they are the ones available to do more work in the home. Which, as unfeminist of me as it is to say so, makes perfect sense. There's a logic there. There's a common sense about this rationalization that's difficult to dispute. But what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Does this situation exist because women typically have fewer work demands, so they are simply more available for household and childcare tasks? Or is it that because women have more household and childcare tasks, they are less available for paid work? Didn't think of it that way, did you? There's a great deal of research regarding how women are penalized or held back or overlooked when they have children when they're working. For example, the mummy track is a concept that refers to how female employees may have fewer opportunities at work because they're a mother. So they are sidetracked. They're routed into lower paying dead-end positions. There's the concept of the motherhood penalty, which refers to how women who are mothers suffer a kind of employment penalty compared to women who do not have children in terms of being perceived as less competent, as less committed to their paid work, and thus less likely to be hired in the first place or to be promoted. So I'll ask again. The time availability perspective says that women usually have more time because of fewer demands at work. But does this situation exist because women typically have fewer work demands, so they are simply more available for household and childcare tasks? Or is it that because women have more household and childcare tasks, that they're less available for paid labor? I don't know. But I think we can all agree that baby chickens are cute. Another possible explanation for the gendered difference in household and childcare responsibility is called the relative resources hypothesis. This says is that what it all comes down to basically is whose work is more important. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's essentially what it says. According to the relative resource perspective, the gendered division of labor in families is determined by who provides the majority of the resources for the family. Who's paid more? Whose job provides the medical benefits? That kind of thing. Whose job is more important? So with this in mind, whoever contributes more resources is considered or should be considered less responsible for looking after the home. And then there is the gender perspective of the gender division of labor. And again, I'm paraphrasing, which says that, you know what? It's always been this way. It's completely ingrained in society. And because it's such a deeply entrenched norm, so far we just haven't been able to change it. That it's going to take a lot longer to kind of get out of this habit, this norm, this typical way of things. It's a strong, long-standing norm that's always existed, and because of this, it's shifted somewhat, but no, it hasn't been completely altered. It's just the way it's always been. Most of it don't even think about it. We can even see the gender perspective in regards to what males and females are expected to do in the house for their chores or jobs growing up. You know, I'm one of 4 kids, 2 girls, 2 boys. I never touched a lawnmower growing up, but my brothers did. This was pretty typical. They didn't do much in the kitchen, but I did, which again is pretty typical. In the last class, I spoke about gender socialization, gender roles, including how these are specifically taught and how they're just absorbed in the home. That's what I'm talking about here. And I also want to specifically highlight something that I speak about in the Adolescent Society course that's well documented, and that is gender socialization intensifies and grows stronger as you enter adolescence. Your text alludes to this when it says that as children, shows in the home are less likely to be based on gender, but into adolescence and the teenage years, they become more and more gender specific. Actually, all gender socialization becomes more intense in adolescence. There's more pressure to adhere to gender norms. It becomes more intense. And kids become much more aware of it and the expectations of them based on it. This is true in regards to what jobs adolescents are responsible for around their house. And this is true in regards to how much time they spend doing those jobs, with teenage girls doing more than teenage boys on average, which contributes to why mothers continue to do more than fathers. Females are considered more responsible for that kind of work in their family of origin.